All right, everybody, thanks for coming today. You guys all doing okay? Everybody looks in a splendid mood. Okay. So the plan for today is to finish up this review chapter, I guess, on supply and demand. I really don't have very much more to cover. I just want to kind of cover this concept of equilibrium today. We should be able to do that in about 15 or so minutes. And then I've got several practice problems that we can work together, and those who are joining us on Zoom can also work as well. I think some of them are posted to Blackboard. A few of them I don't believe are, but they're all good questions of the type that you might see on an exam. So I've got enough time to do that today. So let's go ahead and if there's no questions before we get started, let's just pick up where we left off last time. So we finished our discussion of both supply and demand separately. And now we want to put these two concepts together so that we can talk about this thing called equilibrium. So the demand curve shows a relationship between price and quantity demanded for any particular good. It does not, however, tell us what the exact price or quantity is going to be in a market. Just by looking at the demand curve, we can't figure out what the price is going to be. Nor can we just look at the supply curve by itself and determine what price and quantity are going to be in most circumstances, right? The supply curve just traces out a relationship between price and quantity supplied. If we want to think about what actual prices are going to prevail in a market setting, we need to interact supply and demand together. Okay, it turns out that there is only one price at which quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And you guys all know this. This goes all the way back to your high school econ classes. It occurs right here at the intersection of the supply and demand schedule, right? So in this little example here, I haven't specified what good this is. This is just any arbitrary item. The equilibrium price occurs here at $3. We call this the equilibrium price because at this particular price, the wants of buyers exactly balance the wants of sellers. To be more specific about that, the preferences of the marginal buyer here are exactly balanced by the preferences of the marginal seller of this good. And that occurs right here at this intersection point. Now let me ask you guys somewhat of an abstract question that's not really in the slides. How can we be certain that there's not more than one intersection point here? In other words, if you follow my pointer, how do we know that the demand curve doesn't do something like this, where it crosses the supply curve at a few different places? Right? I'm telling you that the equilibrium price occurs at the intersection of demand and supply, but couldn't there in theory be multiple intersection points? Couldn't the supply curve go like this? Who am I looking at? Sam, go ahead. Perfect. That's a great answer, right? We know that a unique equilibrium price exists, a unique one, only one. Why? Because otherwise something in the model would violate the laws of supply or demand. What does the law of demand say, Sam? It says that as price falls, quantity demanded always rises. Or the law of supply says that as price rises, quantity supplied always goes up. So the only way to have more than one intersection point here is if either the demand or the supply curve had the wrong slope over some region here in the quantity space. So we know that we can rule out the possibility of multiple market equilibria because demand is strictly downward sloping, supply is strictly upward sloping because of the laws of supply and demand. The equilibrium quantity is pretty easy to think about. That's just the quantity that prevails at the equilibrium price. So in this example, the equilibrium price is $3, the equilibrium quantity is 15, right? we could figure out the equilibrium quantity by plugging in the price into the demand curve or into the supply curve. It should be exactly the same thing. Okay. Before we go on to a couple of examples here, let me just take a minute and ask you guys a somewhat more abstract question. And that is why we call this situation right here at the intersection of the demand and supply curve an equilibrium. When you hear that word, equilibrium, what does it mean to you? What does it signify? It's not a word that we always necessarily use with economics, right? You might have heard of this term before in perhaps one of your science classes in high school or college. What does that mean for a body or a system or something to be in equilibrium? What do we mean when we say that? Matt, was that your name? Okay, go ahead. Yeah, so something, I think that's a good answer. So something is in equilibrium if it is more or less in a state of balance. Or I think even more specifically, if all the forces that are acting on that body or object kind of perfectly offset one another so that the system is in balance, is stable, is resting, right? Let's take the size of that typical human body, right? We're not getting, if our body weight is in equilibrium, then that means we're not getting heavier and we're not getting lighter, right? Well, how does that occur? Well, your body weight is going to be in equilibrium if you're doing what? If you're basically consuming the same number of calories that you are burning every day through exercise or just going about your business, right? What happens though if you start to burn more calories than you consume? You're going to lose weight, right? That's a simple math problem. What happens if you start to consume more calories than you're actually burning every day? You're going to gain weight, right? Your body weight is going to rise. In those two examples, your body would be sort of out of equilibrium, all right? Markets work kind of the same way. Markets reach a state of equilibrium when all of the forces acting on prices and quantities more or less perfectly offset one another, okay? Moreover, when a market is out of equilibrium, if for some reason the price is away from the equilibrium price, then what's going to happen is the natural forces of supply and demand are going to start to work in concert with one another in order to bring the price back towards the equilibrium price, right? If you start to lose a bunch of weight, you're going to get hungry, right? Everyone experiences that. And that hunger triggers you to eat more and your weight is going to rise naturally back towards your equilibrium weight. So that's the way I kind of want you guys to think about this idea of equilibrium. It's that all the forces in the economy are tending to offset one another perfectly. But even more important, if we're somehow away from the price, if some disturbance happens in the economy that causes price to move away from $3, something's going to happen to cause price to be pushed back down towards that $3 equilibrium. Let's look at a couple of these scenarios real quick. So let's do a thought experiment here. What if something happens in this market that causes the price to be $5 instead of $3? Go to the store and you see that whatever good we're talking about here is selling for $5 instead of $3. What is going to happen in this particular market? Or what are we going to observe? We're going to observe that what? Quantity demanded at a price of $5 is 9 units of the good, whereas quantity supplied is, what do I have here, 25? What do we call this situation where the supply of a good exceeds the demand at the prevailing price? We call that an excess supply. Or sometimes it's known as a surplus in the market. The size of the surplus can be computed easily by taking the horizontal distance here between the supply and the demand curve, right? That is 25 units supplied minus 9 units demanded, and so the surplus is 16. When we observe a surplus in this market, that is, goods are piling up on the store shelves, that signals to us that the market is out of equilibrium. What's going to happen, though? Is it really make any sense for this surplus to persist for a long time? How do firms and buyers respond to this situation? Yeah, fourth row. Yeah, think about what's going on here. We have sellers, a lot of them, competing over scarce buyers on the margin, right? That's going to give firms an incentive to try to lower their price. And when they do, let's say they lower their price to $4, that's going to cause quantity supplied to fall because of the law of supply. It's going to cause quantity demanded to rise because of the law of demand. And we're going to result in a new situation where we still have a shortage or an excess supply, but it's just not as much, right? In this situation, it is what, 20 minus 12. So the excess supply or the shortage is, I'm sorry, the surplus is 8 units of this good. But again, observing this surplus, we know that the market is still out of equilibrium. So what was your name on the fourth row? Alex. Alex, the situation you just described is going to continue. Here we have firms are still competing over scarce buyers. And so there's this incentive to drop the price. The price is going to continue to fall until we get to a price of exactly $3. Now let's think about this for a second. Why does the price stop falling at $3? At a price of exactly $3, how much does the 15th buyer, if you will, in this example, value this product? Trace up to the demand curve and over, and we see that the value of this good to the marginal or the 15th buyer here is exactly $3. What is the cost to the marginal seller of supplying the 15th unit of this good? Trace up to the supply curve and over, and it's exactly $3. That's the point at which the value to the marginal buyer is equal to the cost to the marginal seller. Those two things balance, they perfectly offset one another, and the market is going to be in equilibrium. We might have a buyer who wants to buy more, but only if the price falls below $3, in which case we're going to have sellers who want to exit the market. So right here at the intersection point, we have this nice equilibrium. Almost exactly the opposite of what we just described happens if the price is too low, right? Let's say the price here is $1. Then what situation we have? We have a quantity demanded is 21, quantity supplied is 5, and so instead of a surplus of this product, we have an excess demand or a shortage of the product in the amount of 16 units. Observing this shortage tells us that the market is not in equilibrium, right? A surplus is a situation where the goods are piling up on store shelves. A shortage is the opposite situation, where you go to the store and they're completely stocked out all the time. Okay, what are firms going to have an incentive to do in this situation? Here, there are buyers, a lot of them, competing over scarce sellers. Firms in this case can start to bid up the price and not actually lose any sales, right? In fact, they'll gain sales. If the price here were to rise to $2, quantity demanded would fall, but quantity supplied would go up. And the new excess demand or the new shortage would be, what is that, 18 minus 10, so a shortage of about 8. That shortage, again, indicates that the market is still not in equilibrium. And so firms are going to continue to want to bid up the price until the cost to the marginal seller balances the value of the marginal buyer, right there at $3 per unit and an equilibrium quantity of 15. Right? So just like my hunger signals to my body to eat more food and I'm going to gain weight as a result of that to reach my equilibrium weight, the market forces of supply and demand that create shortages and surpluses will work in tandem with one another to drive the price in a free market system towards this equilibrium price. Now, it is true, some of the markets that you guys deal with have certain frictions or barriers in them that prevent prices from fully adjusting to the equilibrium. In those cases, that's where you're going to observe chronic surpluses or shortages. But if the market allows the price to fluctuate freely, you should see quantity demanded and supply balancing one another over time. Okay, any questions about that? Any questions from you folks online? This concept of equilibrium is extremely important. That's why I wanted to review it today. Again, we're going to apply it throughout the semester when we discuss different macroeconomic models. How demand and supply adjust to balance one another is important for thinking about all types of topics in the realm of macro theory. Here's a cool article in this publication called Quartz, titled "Taylor Swift is Smart Enough Not to Let Her Shows Sell Out, Ever." So you would think she's so popular that the tickets for her shows would completely sell out. But in fact, whoever is designing the price mechanism for her shows has figured out the right way to allow the price to fluctuate properly so that if you want to go to one of her concerts bad enough, you should be able to get there. Okay, let's do some examples together. I've got a few that are in the slides, and then we'll move to some of the questions that are on another document. So on a problem set or on an exam, you might be confronted with a scenario that describes some event. And then I might ask you, I want you guys to use the tools of supply and demand to tell me how price and quantity, or one or the other, is going to be affected by this event in equilibrium. All right? It's a pretty straightforward type question. I would encourage you to kind of go through these systematically. And I think for beginner econ students, it's easiest if you kind of apply a three-step rule, okay? First, decide whether the event that I'm describing affects or shifts the supply curve, the demand curve, or possibly both. Then ask yourself, in which direction does the curve or curves shift? And then use a simple supply and demand apparatus to see how that shift is going to change price and quantity. A shift in supply or demand is going to create a temporary surplus or shortage, which will then cause prices to move up or down depending on which of those two things occur. All right? We'll work through a couple of easy examples here in class on the slides, and then we'll move to the practice problems. I see some pencils moving furiously. Do I need to slow down? You guys got it? Okay. Let's take a look at a market, hypothetical market for electric cars. So I've got my price of electric cars on the vertical axis, quantity on the horizontal axis, price, a demand curve and a supply curve for electric cars. And then we have some initial equilibrium price and quantity. If you see a problem of this type on an exam, I would always simply draw a demand and supply curve first and an initial equilibrium point. That'll be a good reference point that you can compare your answer to. That is, in which direction will price and quantity move. Okay, let's do an example. What if I were to tell you, what do you think happens to the price and quantity of electric cars in equilibrium if there is a sustained increase in the price of gasoline? Three-step rule. Does that affect supply, demand, both, or neither? And then which direction do those curves shift? So if there's a sustained increase in the price of regular old automobile fuel, gasoline, do you think that'll affect in the long run the demand or the supply directly for electric or hybrid cars, let's say? In fact, I think this is maybe one of the questions that I asked you when we tried to motivate this topic in the last class. Fourth row. The demand is going to be affected, right? Traditional gas guzzling cars, I guess, are a substitute for electric cars. So as gas becomes more expensive, you might want to substitute away from that product, which is becoming relatively more expensive to operate. I agree, the demand is going to be affected here. So that's step one. And then what was your name again? Sorry? Sean. I should know that by now. Okay, and you also got step two here. Okay, so the demand curve is going to shift, but it doesn't affect the supply curve directly. That is sellers' willingness and ability to produce these cars. Step two is that the demand curve will shift right for the reasons just explained, right? It's going to cost more to operate traditional gasoline-based cars, and so some consumers might want to switch to electric cars. I have hybrids here. I forgot to say electric. Those are technically different. Okay, and then Sean, what's going to happen then to equilibrium prices and quantities in this market? Right, you just look at your graph here and price is going to go up and equilibrium quantity is going to rise as well. Okay, now if you want to think about how this actually plays out in the real world, Sean, if the price is P1 and demand is suddenly higher, then what's happened here? Quantity demanded is now bigger than quantity supplied at P1. So we have a shortage of the product or an excess demand. And we saw that that causes firms to bid up the price of that product. So this shortage means that we're temporarily out of equilibrium. The price will rise until those two things balance one another at P2. Easy enough? Okay. How about a second example here? What if there is a new technology that reduces the cost of producing electric cars? Does that affect supply or demand directly? An improvement in technology, remember, was one of those factors that influences the supply, not the demand, right? So step one tells us that the supply curve is going to shift, but not the demand curve. Quantity demanded will change because the price is going to end up changing. And so we will move along a demand curve, but it's going to be the supply curve that shifts. And which direction will the supply curve shift? If there's an improvement in technology that reduces costs, that's going to cause the supply curve to shift to the right. That's kind of similar to a reduction in input prices. So the supply curve shifts out here to S2. Now we can figure out what happens to price and quantity. At a price of P1, supply now exceeds demand. So we have an excess supply of electric cars. There is a surplus on the market. There are sellers competing for scarce buyers. Sellers are going to start to bid down the price until the desires of buyers and sellers balance one another, which occurs at the new equilibrium price, let's say P2. So prices fall, quantities rise in equilibrium. If I ask you to do some problems like this on the exam, okay, I'm not looking for a long essay response, but I do want a clearly labeled supply and demand curve with the axes labeled. I want the initial equilibrium point labeled clearly. I can see what price and quantity you're talking about. Tell me which curve shifts and do a little arrow here so that I see which direction the curve is shifting. Try to be really clear about your graph, okay? I'm not a mind reader. I want it to be almost obvious to me so that I know that you know the material well. All right, last example. What if I ask you what happens in this market if both of the first two events happen roughly at the same time? So the price of gas goes up and there's a new technology that reduces production costs. Well, common sense tells you that it's going to affect both the demand and the supply curve, right? Well, higher gas prices we saw shift the demand schedule to the right, and improved technology shifts the supply of electric cars to the right. So here's a rightward shift in demand. Here's a rightward shift in supply. Step 3 says, look at the picture and tell me where the new price and quantity are. Looks like prices have gone up to P2 and equilibrium quantities have increased. Who likes that answer? Is there anything wrong with that answer? Is there anything perhaps incomplete about the answer? Sean? Not necessarily in different order, but by different magnitudes, amounts, right? Here in the picture, what have I done? I've got the demand curve shifting by a lot and the supply curve by not as much. When that happens, prices rise and quantities rise. But what would have happened if instead the supply of electric cars was really sensitive to this improvement in technology? So the supply curve shifted out a lot, but yet the demand was not as sensitive to an increase in gas prices. So demand didn't shift as much. What would happen to equilibrium prices and quantities in that case? Quantities would still go up. That is unambiguous, right? But the price would have actually gone down in equilibrium. So in this question, the 100% correct answer is that the effect on quantity is positive, it rises, but the effect on equilibrium prices is ambiguous. Without further information, we don't really know from the problem conclusively whether or not prices are going to go up, down, or stay the same. It all depends on the relative size of the shift in the supply versus the demand curve. Sometime I might not give you enough information in the problem to be able to conclude which of those two scenarios actually plays itself out. And you'll need to be able to recognize that it could be one or the other. Any questions, Matt? Yeah. You had to draw a little arrow right here and a little arrow right here. Well, then your previous econ teacher didn't know that 2 follows 1. I'm not going to be that. I would like to see you get the curve shifting in the right direction. And in fact, I don't care if you call this Q prime and Q double prime. I can tell what the terminal and initial points are based on the direction that your curves shift. Or you can write it in a sentence if you want. Sorry, speak up a little bit louder. Yeah, so what in that situation you could do one of the following. You could show a graph that has 2 different possible intersections, right? Like you could envision this picture here where you drew a third demand curve that was way out here where the price actually went up, or you can draw 2 graphs side by side and just explain in a sentence or two, you know, it depends on the size of the shift in the 2 curves. Yeah, some of these problems you will need to explain in words a little bit, but I'm not going to ask you a drawn-out essay-style question. You know, 2, 3 sentences should suffice. Full English sentences that start with a capital letter and end in a period. Okay, any other questions about that? All right, we have got plenty of time today, so let me how do I want to do this? Let's see. some of these we can probably just talk about in words that you can describe. A few others I might want you to actually trace an answer, sketch an answer down. So I may have to juggle back and forth here between the PDF document and the document camera. So let's take a look at number 1 first. And again, these questions are, I believe they're on Blackboard. In fact, I'm almost certain that they are. Consider the market for minivans. For each of the events listed below, identify which of the determinants of demand or supply are affected. Also indicate whether demand or supply increases or decreases. Then draw a diagram to show the effect on equilibrium price and quantity of minivans. We can do that if you want, or else we can just describe it and you can kind of see if price goes up or down. How about part A? People decide to have more children. How do you think that affects the demand and or the supply for minivans, and why? And when answering these questions, I want you guys to think back to the last class about some of those common factors that cause demand or supply to shift around. Can you appeal to any of those in describing what happens here? People decide to have more children. We're worried about population growth. All right, so families are having more kids. Sean, what do you think happens? The demand, that will probably affect the demand for minivans as opposed to the supply directly, and it will increase or shift to the right. Now, why is that? What's bingo? I think, yeah, remember, preferences or tastes are things that can affect demand that economists don't try to explain. Rather, we just try to figure out how they affect demand. If suddenly families are getting larger, there's probably going to be a preference change from mid-size cars to larger cars like minivans. And so the demand curve will shift to the right. And what happens to price and quantity? Both go up. If you don't believe me, draw a demand and supply schedule and shift your demand curve to the right and see what happens. How about part B? A strike by steel workers raises steel prices. How does that affect the market for minivans? Matt? Yeah, so if there is a strike by steel workers, then that's going to affect inputs, right? And so steel prices rise. So the cost of producing minivans is going to go up. And we saw that input prices are a big influencer of the market supply curve. If input prices rise, the market supply schedule will shift back to the left. And that, Matt, should lower quantities and raise prices, right? How about engineers develop new automated machinery for the production of minivans? Does that affect supply or demand? Back row? It's going to affect the supply. Why? Sorry? Possibly, but I would say more directly, if a new automated machinery is developed, that sounds to me a little bit more like a technological improvement that ultimately could lower input prices, but is probably more directly related to technology, which would cause the supply schedule to shift to the right, and therefore quantities to rise and prices to fall. How about the price of sport utility vehicles rises? What do you think happens to the market for minivans in that case? SUV prices go up. Affect the demand or supply, you think, for minivans? Sean? Why? Yeah, SUVs and minivans might be regarded by some people as substitute products. So SUV prices rise. Some consumers will shift away from the expensive item towards the cheaper item. That causes the demand schedule to shift to the right. And then, Sean, what happens? The price rises, which is kind of funny, right? The whole reason why people are substituting away from SUVs into minivans is because minivans are cheaper. But that very action does what to the price of minivans? It raises the price. Therefore, those general equilibrium effects cause us not to save as much money when we make that substitution. A stock market crash lowers people's wealth. Alex? Well, I think the key thing here is people's wealth, right? Another way of thinking of that is also in terms of income and wealth are not the same thing, but both of them have a big impact on our ability and willingness to pay for items. And so if there's a big stock market crash that destroys a bunch of our wealth, we're not as likely to want to buy as many normal goods. As long as minivans are a normal good, then the demand would fall and prices would drop, quantities would drop. Okay, y'all have any, Matt? How dare you? I have a minivan and two kids that love that minivan. You could, no, I don't think I would take off for that. But there are going to be no more quizzes. You only took one quiz this semester. On an exam, you might, I think you might be able to get away with that. But I would encourage you to answer with a more traditionally accepted. My wife wants an SUV. I think I got to buy her one for Christmas. We've had this van for like 10 years now, and she keeps saying, I want an SUV. I want a Honda Passport, I think is what she wants. Okay, why don't you guys try this one? This one's kind of an interesting question. So let's suppose a survey shows that there's an increase in drug use by young people. Uh-oh. In the ensuing debate, two hypotheses are proposed. One, reduced police efforts have increased the availability of drugs on the street. Or two, cutbacks in education efforts have decreased awareness of the dangers of drug addiction. Both of these hypotheses are being proposed as a reason why drug use is on the rise among youngsters. Part A, use supply and demand diagrams to show how each hypothesis could actually be consistent with an increase in drug use. And then part B, think about how information on the street prices of drugs might help us discriminate or distinguish between these two explanations. Which might be the more dominant factor if we also take into consideration what's happening to prices, which isn't part of the survey apparently. Why don't you guys take a few minutes and try to answer those on your own paper, and then we will demonstrate them together on the document camera here. Okay, how about the first hypothesis? So reduced police efforts have increased the availability of drugs on the street. So I'm going to illustrate the effects of that situation on the left graph here. So here is a hypothetical drug market, right? We have price and quantity, an upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand, and some initial equilibrium point. If the situation in this problem were true, how would that affect the supply or the demand for drugs on the street, you think? If there were reduced police efforts have actually increased the availability of drugs, you think that would affect the demand or the supply? Sean? Yeah, I agree, the supply. In which direction would the supply curve shift? To the right. Something like this, right? And so, Sean, what would happen in this market if prices adjust freely in equilibrium? The price would go down. So, Matt, there's your little arrow. And equilibrium quantity would go up. So, this hypothesis is consistent with the question, right? The question says a survey shows an increase in drug use by young people. This scenario shows us that drug usage, as measured by equilibrium quantity, would indeed go up. So that's a plausible explanation. What about the second scenario? Cutbacks in education efforts have decreased awareness of the dangers of drug addiction. You think that affects the demand or the supply for drugs? Cutbacks in education efforts have decreased the awareness of dangers. Help me out here. Josh, go ahead. Yeah, that sounds to me like it would affect the demand for drugs. And which direction do you think this demand curve would shift? To the right. So if there's less awareness about how dangerous these substances are, then the demand might shift to the right. And as a result, Josh, what would happen? Equilibrium prices would rise, equilibrium quantities would rise. Once again, we see this as a very plausible story, right? If this were to happen, our simple little supply and demand model would predict a rise in drug use amongst the young. So either of these two stories seems to fit the hypothesis. Part B, how could information on what has happened to the price of drugs help us distinguish between which is a better theory? Alex. Yeah, if scenario one were true, we would expect to see lower drug prices. If scenario two was true, we would expect to see higher drug prices. So if the survey also collected information on how much the young were paying for these drugs, not just how much they're actually consuming, then we might better be able to distinguish between which of these two theories is correct. So information about which direction prices have moved, it would be critical to being able to say conclusively if it's reduced police efforts or if it's cutbacks in education. Very good. Okay. Any questions about that one then? How about number 5? When you arrive at the gas station, you can't see that, can you? When you arrive at the gas station, there is a line of cars wrapped around the block waiting for gas. So you go to the gas station down the road, only to find another line of cars. You get in line and end up waiting over an hour just to get to the pump, and then are told that they've run out of gas. Is this market in equilibrium? Why or why not? Well, you could probably tell me the answer to this without actually constructing a graph, but let me do it anyway. Let's say we have some market for gasoline, downward sloping demand, upward supply, and if everything were working correct, we would be at some equilibrium price and quantity. Let's call it P1, Q1. What kind of situation are we describing in the problem, though? You go to the gas station, there's a huge line. You go down the street, there's another huge line, and then they sell out of gas. Does that sound like, what type of situation does that sound like to you, Sean? That sounds like a shortage. Well, we know shortages occur when the price is too low, let's say P2. At that point, we have the quantity demanded is considerably larger than quantity supplied. All right, this is a surplus. We know that that situation can't be an equilibrium, right? I'm sorry, a shortage. Yeah, losing my mind today. Thank you, Matt. So this situation is going to be a shortage, and so it can't possibly be an equilibrium, right? A market is not going to be an equilibrium if you have to queue up for that item, right? Otherwise, when a market is in equilibrium, again, think about what's happening. At the equilibrium price, what is the value of a gallon of gasoline to the Q first buyer? Exactly P1, right? And what is the cost of supplying that marginal gallon of gas to the customer? Exactly P1, right? If there is a line and a huge shortage of the product, then that tells us that there are more people who are willing to pay more than what firms or businesses are willing to supply at that point. So anytime you see that type of situation emerge in a market, you know it is out of equilibrium. And for some reason, the price is being prevented from going up enough to clear the market. How about number 4? This one's a little different, but applies the same concept that we saw in class. Again, I need to switch you guys back to the PC. So this is one that involves a little bit of algebra, okay? But it is not difficult, trust me. Market research has revealed the following information about the market for chocolate bars. The demand schedule can be represented as QD is equal to 1600 minus 300 times P, where P is the price, and QD is quantity demanded. The supply can be represented by another equation. QS is equal to 1400 plus 700 times price. Can you guys compute the equilibrium price and quantity? So in class today, we did all of this graphically. And what do we know is true about equilibrium? That's the point at which the demand curve intersects the supply curve. It's the price that balances quantity supplied with quantity demanded. Can you apply the exact same concept in a different environment? One where I'm giving you actual equations that represent demand and supply instead of pictures or graphs. Okay, so here is the demand curve. QD is equal to 1600 minus 300 times P, and quantity supplied is 1400 plus 700 times P. How do we find the equilibrium price and quantity in this situation? Sean? Yeah, that's the most important part of this. If you can just get this part, you'll demonstrate to me that you conceptually understand what you're doing. In equilibrium, we know that quantity demanded has to equal quantity supplied. That's the key equilibrium condition of this model. This simple supply and demand model predicts that prices should move up or down to clear the market, to eliminate shortages and eliminate surpluses, to balance quantity supplied with quantity demanded. So we set those two concepts or those two variables equal to one another. And Sean, how can I do this? This is what, 1600 minus 300 times P, that's quantity demanded, is equal to quantity supplied, which was what, 1400 plus 700 times P. So if we subtract 1400 from both sides, we're left with what, 200? And if we add 300 times P to both sides of the equation, we get 1000 times P. Everybody's algebra skills not too atrophied, right? This is very, very easy math. And then simply divide both sides of the equation by 1000. And we get that the equilibrium price is 1/5. Sean, how do we get the equilibrium quantity? Yeah, you can take your equilibrium price and stick it back into either quantity supplied or quantity demanded, because those two things have to be equal to each other, right? So Q is equal to, let's say, 1600 minus 300 times P, which was 1/5, and you punch that into your calculator, and I think you get 1540. So that's just a simple algebraic version of the types of problems we've done in class today, where we talk about the intersection of supply and demand. Alex? Oh, it's the units don't matter. I know that's kind of awkward. We don't need to talk about dollars and that type of problem. Let's do one more. Back to the PC. Why don't you guys try to work this one? So it's number 7. I'll read it and then give you guys about 5 minutes to sketch an answer. According to a 2016 Wall Street Journal article, after years of relative equilibrium, the job market for nurses is heating up in many markets, driving up wages and sign-on bonuses for the nation's 5th largest occupation. This is from an actual Wall Street Journal article. Many nurses who previously delayed their retirement due to the 2008 recession tied to the financial crisis had begun to retire by 2016, resulting in a retirement wave that caused nurses to exit the workforce in greater numbers than new nurses were entering. At the same time, demand for nurses had increased due to additional healthcare coverage associated with job growth over the previous decade, as well as the Affordable Care Act legislation. Part A, I want you guys to draw a demand and supply graph simply illustrating the developments that are being discussed in this article on the market for nurses. And then for part B, I want you to forecast what you would expect to see happen to the wage for nurses. as a result of what you describe in part A? Is it consistent with what is actually being described or observed in the article? And then part C asks you briefly discuss whether this problem provides information enough to determine what happens to quantities of nurses in the labor market. Do they go up or down? So why don't you guys take 4 or 5 minutes or so and try to sketch an answer to that. I like this type of question, right? It's pulled from an actual news source and describes something that's happening in the real world. And what I want you to do is use these models that we talk about in class as a lens to view those real world issues. Okay? Does the economic model accurately describe what we see going on around us? Okay. Hopefully you guys had enough time to sketch an answer. So what I've got here so far is just a setup of this problem where we're looking at kind of a hypothetical market, labor market that is, for nurses. The quantity of the good is the number of nurses, or labor, right? So that's what I have here on the horizontal axis. So instead of denoting that with a Q, I'm going to call it employment or labor. The price of labor in this case we call the wage, right? And so here's my initial equilibrium point. At a wage of W1, the supply and demand for nurses balance, and there are L1 nurses employed. All right? Now, who can help me out on this one? What happens according to the events in this article. There is a wave of retirements that occurs in recent years because people had delayed their retirement from earlier as a result of the financial crisis. But then there's also an increase in the demand for nurses at hospitals because of the increased need for hospitals associated with job growth and the Affordable Care Act. So what's happening here? Can we illustrate these events graphically? Matt? Well, sure we can. We can graph them at the same time. Maybe that will lead to an ambiguity in one of the variables, but we certainly can draw them, right? So what happens if there's this kind of wave of retirements where nurses are exiting the workforce? The supply is going to shift to the left. Now, Matt, to your point, who knows how far it shifts? I mean, the article says wave. That kind of implies a big exit from the labor force, but who knows the exact size? Now, all else equal, what would we expect to happen here? With the supply shifting to the left, that's going to have, at the previous wage, you're going to have demand exceeding supply. So there would be a shortage of nurses in the labor market, which would cause the wage to be bid up and the quantity of nurses to fall. But what else is going on in this article? It says that there's more of a need for nurses now to service the people who've gotten sick but have coverage under the Affordable Care Act, right? And so that affects what? The hospital's demand for nurses, right? And so the demand curve should shift to the right. Again, Matt, to your point, we don't know exactly how far it shifts to the right, just that it shifts to the right. And so the way I've drawn it here, we have what does our model predict is going to happen to wages for nurses in the market? It's going to go up, right? In fact, the rightward shift in demand amplifies the increase in wages for nurses that we would see just from a left shift in supply. So both of those two things together are causing wages for nurses to go up quite a lot, more so than if either had happened just by themselves, right? So our model predicts that nurses' wages should go up as a result of these two forces in the market. Part C asks about the quantity of nurses in the labor market. What does the model predict here? Well, the way I've graphed it, I'm showing a reduction in the quantity of nurses in equilibrium. But certainly I could have assumed that the shift in demand was a lot, right? And instead of going from here to here, we went from here to here, in which case the wage would have gone up even more, but there would have been more nurses hired. And so the effect on quantity, or the effect on labor in this case, is ambiguous, right? So Alex, maybe this answers the question you asked earlier, how to demonstrate this type of scenario on a test. You could do something like I did, where you have a situation where one curve shifts by less than the other, but also a part B scenario where it shifts by more than the other, right? So here there is an ambiguity concerning the quantity of labor in the nursing market, but the effect on wages is positive, unambiguously, right? So our simple supply and demand model forecasts correctly that wages and signing bonuses for nurses should have gone up during this period, and indeed it did. Okay, you guys have any questions about that? Hopefully that is enough practice, demand, and supply type problems for you to have totally mastered this material. What are we going to do next? So next Tuesday, we're going to start our first topic in this course that is really squarely about macroeconomics. We're going to talk about some of the data that we use in macroeconomics to actually observe what's happening to the overall economy. We'll spend a few weeks talking about that, and then I think we'll be ready for your first midterm exam. Over the next, I think, so next week we should have an opportunity I should say in the coming weeks for you guys to do like an extra credit exercise during class that uses some actual macroeconomic data. I'll give you more specifics about when that comes up, but it's not going to be for another couple of weeks, okay? Any other questions? All right, guys, gals, have a good weekend.